I know that if you guys are having the same kind of clients that I am, meaning the human kind, then you're going to be dealing with shame as a pretty primary function of what's in their way. So we spoke about this, probably a year, maybe 18 months ago. We talked about this. And at the time, I was referencing a lot of the contrast between shame and compassion and vulnerability, and the difference between shame and guilt. And all of that is important. And I am going to go over it again because I don't think it's something that can be emphasized too much. And I've learned a lot since. So I've brought into my coaching a lot of shame-specific exercises, just recognizing that I do think it's one of the emotions that gets in the way ahead of almost anything else. So, those of you who are PRAC trained and PACE trained, we always, and so does all of the TAD school of NLP, always says that you should clear anger, sadness, hurt, fear, and guilt, right? The big five. And we do those ahead of anything else. And I still think that that's a good way to start. I still think that that's an effective way to make sure that you're kind of clearing your bases in terms of, running into those basic emotions. There is nobody, if you've lived until the age of like 5, then you have dealt with an accumulation of anger, sadness, hurt, fear, and guilt, right? But shame is one that is less talked about, first of all, like it's just a less understood emotion, I think. And it does have an ability to get installed really, really young, just like all the other ones, but it requires some sophistication to understand it, right? So if you think about like that 0 to 7 imprint period of our life, when a child feels fear, there's nothing complex about it, right? Like it might be complex, the source and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, a child feels fear, they express fear, and the resolution to fear is understanding that they're safe again, right? Whatever the situation may be, it doesn't really vary from that. And so the same is true of sadness, right? When a child is sad, because whatever reason, they dropped their noodles or somebody stole their toy or whatever, they're sad. And the experience of being sad is one that is similarly recognized and felt. And the truth is, we don't really feel sadness all that differently when we're 18 than we did when we were 2. Like sadness just feels tremendously sad in the body. If you think back to the experiences in your life where you have felt sadness, try and separate it from things like disappointment or grief or any of those like variations, but just purely sad. Like maybe you had a concert that you were going to go to and your car broke down, so you couldn't go and you were just sad about it. Or you lost, you lost something that was meaningful to you, and it's not in that realm of grief, but it just made you sad. If you think about the experiences that you've had with sadness throughout your life, it's unlikely, I'm not saying it's not possible, of course, but it's unlikely that it feels very different today than it did 10 years ago and 10 years before that. So the reason that we do these, like the 5 emotions, anger, sadness, fear, hurt, guilt, is because they're quite static. They're big emotions, right? I mean, they're enormous emotions. They probably, if you had a pie graph of emotions, it may be that on that pie graph that these big 5 take up, more room than just about anything else. But it doesn't mean that they're static in that they're experienced pretty much the same way. The other emotions, things like shame, things like disappointment, things like somebody name another emotion. Those tend to be felt and experienced differently. So I don't know about you guys, but if I think about like the way that I handle disappointment today, in contrast to the way that I dealt with disappointment when I was a child, it actually kind of feels different, right? Like I have built up some wherewithal when it comes to disappointment, or for some of you, or for me at times in my life, maybe it's exaggerated. Like it may be that at certain points in my life, I couldn't handle disappointment at all, where before I could. right? So those, and certainly shame is one of these ones. Shame is one that has this very complex way of being felt and experienced throughout your life. And so even though shame can be felt very, very young, like I would, I have cleared shame, as I'm sure you guys have. I've cleared shame at birth. I've cleared shame at, before birth or at 2 years old, or, before there's any conscious processing of what we would expect feels like living up to. It still somehow seems to be something that we can kind of embody and experience. But of course, as shame grows, as we become more mature and we get greater understanding of our context and our world and, all that kind of stuff, our feeling of shame. So if you think about the shame that you may have felt in the last, think of something that you felt some shame around in the last month of your life and compare it to the shame that you felt when you were in elementary school. It's probably pretty different, right? It's probably not felt the same way in your mind or in your body. And again, not to say always, and there may be some aspects of shame that are similar, but there will be some development on it, good, bad, or indifferent. So when we're talking about shame, we're talking about this very specific emotion. So just to put it out there, the question that I have is the common agreement, I think, in a lot of, today's understanding of emotions and of how we process things as human beings. There's sort of an agreement that compassion is that in order to experience the resolution of shame, that there must be compassion. And therefore that in order to be courageous, we're overcoming shame. And that in overcoming shame, we have to be vulnerable, right? So we have to meet. So there's this there's these 4 things that seem to go together: vulnerability, shame, courage, and compassion. So we're gonna sort of talk around this little sort of box of ideas that I'm actually going to write down in front of me so I don't get brain lapses here. Okay, so I want to start just by giving a really clear definition of shame. So those of you that are Brené Brown students will be very familiar with this. Okay, so shame, of course, is different, but often confused with other emotions like guilt, humiliation, and embarrassment. Right? So each of us can probably think of times in our life where you'd be hard pressed to really like pull apart whether the experience that you're having fits one of those 4 categories: shame, guilt, embarrassment, humiliation. So just for a quick sort of understanding of how I'm going to use those in the context of today. And of course, there is no right or wrong when it comes to defining emotions, right? It's not as though there is one wrong definition or right definition, but for the purpose of right now, when we talk about shame, what we're talking about is a deep identified feeling that the self is not good enough. So for shame, there always has to be a standard that is left unmet. So where that standard comes from is anyone's guess, right? So the standard may have been set by parents. It may have been set by society, culture, people of influence, personally in their life or otherwise, and then embodied, right? So a lot of shame does require other people. You cannot feel shame in a vacuum because there must be a standard set. And the only way that we develop expectations, even self-expectations, are from what we gather from the outside and bring it in. Okay. So expectations always come from the outside. If theoretically, if there was a child who grew up in isolation of any other judging entity, they would not ever feel shame because there would be no expectations because there'd be nothing to live up to, right? So shame has this quality of having other people that influence it, and it's always right to the core. So shame is, I am bad. I'm not good enough. I am a liar. I am unworthy. Okay, so they are I am statements. They go right to the core, the essence of sort of identity. This is in contrast to something like guilt. So guilt, of course, is about our behaviors, our actions, our thoughts. So guilt is much more, it can be described as being much more surface, right? So guilt is about our actions. So guilt is something that is requires some level of like a societal, sort of a moral, ethical relationship to your own behavior. So you can feel bad about doing something. You can feel guilty. Sorry, I shouldn't say bad. You can feel guilty about having done something bad. But the internal dialogue is going to sound like, God, I can't believe I just did that. That was so rude. I cannot believe I just said that. I feel so bad. I feel so guilty that I hurt this person. So it's very much like self-talking to self, right? You're having this dialogue with yourself about what you just did or what you just thought or what you just acted out. In contrast to shame, where the inner dialogue would be, I am such a fool. I am so stupid. Now that's shame. Okay. So guilt is something that people often talk about because there is that one level of separation. So I'm going to have a much easier time saying to you guys, if I feel quite guilty about something, I'm going to have a much easier time saying to you guys, I feel really, really guilty about this, but I accidentally spilled my coffee over my notes and I don't have anything here to guide me. So, this may be a shit show. Like I'm going to have an easier time saying that to you if what I'm experiencing is like, I did such a stupid thing. Like I did such a klutzy thing that now it's going to compromise what I'm doing. If I was feeling shame, so if what I had inside of me was a sense of like, I am a total screw up. My shame is that I never do anything right. I'm going to have a much harder time bringing that out into the open and just saying, like, giving you guys the opportunity to judge me because I'm going to feel like you're actually judging me. Whereas when I bring up guilt, I'm setting it up that you can judge my behavior or my action without actually internalizing it as judging me necessarily. So while shame lives deep in the dark, guilt tends to be something that we can talk about, share. Your clients are more likely to share with you the things that they feel guilty about than the things that they feel shame about.
Now I have shame because I sent a message to the group instead of to one person.
Oh. There is no judgment here, Ashley. None. It's funny. That is
me, in case you're wondering.
That is one of our new fears, though, right? Whenever I'm in like a Zoom chat, I'm always so careful because it does people. Yeah. Okay. So the other two, I want to just mention embarrassment and humiliation. So you can kind of mirror them a little bit to guilt and shame in that one of them is very, embarrassment is something that we tend not to be, depending on the extremity of it, embarrassment is something that we're willing to talk about. So the quality of embarrassment is like I did something that made me feel really uncomfortable. I did something that made me feel like everybody saw this kind of flaw in myself. But when we get embarrassed, there is a sense of this is something that other people do too. And so the embarrassment stays in that same way that guilt stays a little disconnected from the actual self. There's a relatedness to embarrassment where you will share an embarrassing story. And the reason it's easier to share embarrassing stories, and even sometimes fun, right? We can tease each other about embarrassing things, knowing that we're not taking the person down, because what we're actually expressing is like a shared experience, right? So what Ashley just said, like there's a sense there, it's probably like embarrassing a little bit, but it's also so clear, hopefully to you and to me, certainly, and I think to everybody else, that like, this is something that we can all so easily do. It's something that we can all relate to and have the experience of like accidentally, sending something to the wrong person or whatever. And so that quality of embarrassment allows us to bring it out, like actually allows us to talk about it in the open. Humiliation, on the other hand, is a deep, dark beast. Humiliation is the sense that something happened to you, that there's an aspect of like, you feel like people think you caused it in a way, like you feel almost like people are putting you at cause, but you didn't deserve to have it happen to you. Humiliation is you had courage, or you were standing in a place of honesty or authenticity or a level of skill. You were asking for truth. You were asking for a response. And you guys all know this with NLP, we do predict our responses, right? Almost all, in fact, all of the time, we predict our responses, right? Even when we're asking a question, we feel it's okay to ask the question because we have a sense of predictability in the response. Right. So even when I say to my friend, hey, do you like this outfit, or do you think that we should go here or there or whatever? I have a scope about that big of predictability of what their answer is going to be. Because if I thought their answer was going to be like, shut the fuck up, bitch, I probably wouldn't ask the question. Right. Like that is not. So you're still sort of putting this like umbrella of predictability over the expected response. And humiliation is when you don't get that. Humiliation is when something happens outside of that predicted response net. And it's deeply, you feel like you don't deserve it. So humiliation is something that we don't like to say out loud. Humiliation's hard to talk about. It's very, very isolating. It's something that people can, it matches shame. It usually matches up with shame. But there is this sense with humiliation. If you can think in your life of different circumstances, like of times when you have felt humiliated, but maybe not shamed. Like if you tell someone you love them and then they laugh at you or something like that, right? Like there's this deep sense of humiliation, but it might not be shame. It's possible that you don't feel any shame around it, just humiliation. So I want to leave that out there because I think those 4 distinctions, I would memorize those. Like I would if you haven't already, I would sort of bring those into your awareness, because it really makes a difference when you're coaching in terms of how you're going to construct the beliefs that are going to support the person in a way that allows them to let go of the belief that may have come from the experience, right? So embarrassment doesn't usually have to be cleared, just as a by the way. Sometimes, and this is a fun little note, clients will sometimes present an embarrassment for clearing, right? So a client will say to me, when I say like, is there anything else that comes up, associated to this problem or whatever? And they'll say, yeah, I still think about this time when, this happened. It was just really embarrassing. And it just like still bugs me. If they present embarrassment, it could well just be embarrassment, but in that case, all you've got to do is reframe it a little bit, right? There's usually just a reframe on, and you all know what I mean, like a context reframe or a content reframe, either way. But what will happen is they'll present an embarrassment when really what they want to clear is the humiliation. Or they'll present guilt when really what they want, they'll say, I got to stop yelling at my husband. I just feel so guilty. I come home at work and he's the one I dump everything on. So he's the one that, I never blah, blah, blah. And it's being presented as guilt. Right? I feel bad about this action that I'm doing, this behavior that I'm doing. So I want you, coach, to help me clear that guilt away so that I can, behave better or whatever the case may be. But what we're really actually dealing with likely is the shame. Because the guilt, yes, it's worthwhile clearing guilt, but you don't need to spend much time with guilt other than that one big sweep that we do, which is, in that big 5 that we do at the beginning, a big sweep on guilt tends to do the job. If significant emotional events don't get cleared, you're likely looking at shame and not guilt, right? So in that example that I just gave, I probably wouldn't stay there. Like I wouldn't say to my client, okay, great. Let's just clear the feeling of you kind of unloading on your husband. I would want to go in a little, right? With that, like, explore the idea of what is it that you might be feeling when you're behaving that way about yourself, right? So probably what we're going to get into is like resentment, right? Or anything else, and look for those deeper emotions that are going to lead you to a shame place for them. So the way that shame shows up, you all likely, this will resonate with everyone very easily and understandably. Shame shows up as control, right? Control is shame's language. And I'm not just talking about like controlling people, because there are people who seek control over others, but I'm kind of talking about the type of control that shows up as trying to control outcomes all of the time. So when there's shame, if you imagine shame as being like a big fat lie underneath that you believe, that it's a lie that you don't want people to find out about, there's a rush to control the outcome so that your lie doesn't get exposed. Make sense? So people so when I have clients who I notice that there is a rushing toward controlling the outcome, right? So they'll show me a behavior of like, they'll say something to me. Have you had this experience? They'll say something to me, and then I'll start to respond to it with a like, yeah, well, why don't we? And they'll cut me off and go, well, actually, I guess what I really meant to say was, and there's this like, I was not answering the way that they wanted me to answer. And therefore, they are going to redirect what they're saying until they can control the outcome, which is my response, right? And this is a behavior that I see very often when somebody has like a bad relationship with their own shame, in that they can't, when I say to them, can you name areas in your life where you do feel shame? Because lots of people will give me a giant list, right? I know I can write like a big long list of those areas. The people who hesitate to do that, who don't want to identify any areas of shame, tend to be the ones who are also doing this like constant sort of control of the outcome everywhere. And so you can imagine that it shows up as exhaustion. So it shows up as control. Shame itself is exhausting. And again, let me preface this with like, I think if you're a human being, you feel shame, just by the way. I think that there are some really, really highly evolved people that probably don't, a very small, tiny percentage of people that don't, because they have truly surpassed, judgment, basically. But if you are a human being who feels empathy, then you're going to feel shame. The only people that wouldn't feel shame, like that actually would not feel shame, are those people who cannot feel empathy. So if they can't imagine themselves as being the feeling of their effect on others, then they may not feel shame. But other than that, everybody has some aspect of shame. So I don't ever, we don't ever want to imagine that there's a goal of having like a completely shameless existence. I don't know if that would be ecological or good for someone. But, when there is excess amounts of shame is what I'm referring to. So the control, the exhaustion that comes with having to constantly kind of cover the tracks of your shame, whether consciously or unconsciously. So I would say almost always when somebody comes into my office and they're just tired, like they're so tired, there is going to likely be shame as sort of the dominant thing that I know I'm going to work through with them. Perfectionism. I mean, I don't know how obvious this is, but perfectionism is shame's best friend, right? Which is also a variation of this, because of course, perfectionism is what allows us to feel as though we're most controlling the outcome, right? So long as I get this perfect, nobody can criticize, nobody can judge, nobody can say I didn't meet the standard or the expectation. Nobody is allowed to shame me if I do it perfectly. right? So it's just such a strong dedication to the avoidance of ever having to tap and touch shame, that it's one, again, if somebody demonstrates that really high level of perfectionism, that would be my indication to pay special attention to shame. Of fear, I shouldn't say obviously. Fear is not. There are people who walk in my office who I would say shame isn't the dominant thing. Where like shame is not the thing that is their driving problem to get through. The people who walk in with fear, where it's in the shape of like anxiety, may have, normal little tinges of shame, but they could actually be, the fear could be driving from a lack of trust and all sorts of other things. But if fear shows up in fear of being seen, fear of showing up, fear of having any expectation on them, all of those things, I'm going to use the word obviously, but obviously come from shame, right? That's where you're going to really investigate the shame. It definitely is the core of things when someone is small, when someone is playing really, really small in their life, when there's deference, when there is self-denigration, when there's like that whole quality of the sentences trail into if they fear that they have even stepped one foot into like arrogance or anything that isn't purely humble, they backtrack it back into sort of like excusing their arrogance. Like everything is conditional on, I know that I'm no better than anybody else, but I know that I don't have the right to tell him or her what to do, but I know that it feels, I know that I could be stronger if I didn't do, so all of that kind of like small language that is diminishing a person, again, seems obvious that that's going to be shame-based. The other little things are like people who lie. So I don't know, those of you that have been coaching for a while, Alan always refers to House, that those of you that are old enough or watched the show House, and the doctor who just his premise, the reason he diagnosed people as well as he did medically was because he assumed that everybody lied. And so he would never, ever, ever take their surface answers. So he would say to them, like, do you drink, pop? If they say no, assume that they do, and then find out how much, like it's just such a hilarious sort of, anyway, it's a little bit true in coaching, right? Everybody lies a little bit. I would say most people don't lie intentionally, but you've heard yourself, right? Like you've heard yourself in your own coaching sessions where you're not intentionally lying. It's not like you're making something up to deliberately withhold that information and hide it from your practitioner or your coach or your whatever, whoever. It's just that you're not, you don't know how to express yourself with pure honesty because it is a very difficult thing to do, right? It is a tricky thing to just go like full honesty and not offer some variation on it. Also, our memories are total garbage, right? So we've established in this group that our memories are such a, sort of bad filter that they're always making things up. So again, even if you're not intentionally lying, you guys know that when I say to you, I went over to my mom's house and I asked for support and she just like completely refused. She doesn't want to give me any support. That's probably not actually what happened, right? Like chances are what I'm telling you is some version of my experience of going to my mom. And she probably said, I'll help you this way, that way, and that way, but not this way. But my experience of it that I'm going to relay back to other people is going to be through my filters and my experience and my emotions and everything else, right? My very limited perspective. And so that's the kind of lie that I mean, is that everybody's going to come in, and when it's shame-based lies, they're going to carry a theme. So you're going to notice that whenever a person is talking about their commitment to their career or something like that, that's when you start to sort of dig, and when you ask how specifically, there's no alignment, there's no consistency. All of a sudden, all the like, oh, how specifically did, and that's when you start to get variations. So I know this is going really detailed, but let it sort of sink in, because it's a good barometer, I would say, as a coach, to be able to kind of track where things are going and where that shame may sort of be nestled. And then the last two is like defensiveness and attack. I mean, I think that's, again, too obvious to even discuss. If the person is really, really defensive, shame. If the person attacks you, right? So if you're in a conversation, not in a coaching situation necessarily, but although it happens there too, but if you're in a situation with someone and they start to attack you, chances are shame, right? And the last one is numbness. So I think perhaps more than anything else, numbness tends to be the primary young response to shame. So when shame settles in at really young ages, numbness is going to be one of the best protectors, right? So if a child, at 1, 2, 3, 4 years old is being made to feel as though they're an inconvenience, or that their needs are too much for others. If you look into like attachment theory, this will show up a lot, right? Like avoidant attachment styles. You decide that you better deal with your own needs, right? You better figure out how to get your own needs met. And this is going to be the best possible cover for shame, right? So you can't be shamed if you're not putting yourself out there to be vulnerable and to ask for it. So, all of these are ways, these are the ones that I see most often. I went through my files. I looked sort of at the last like 50 files that I've done. And this was the common pattern. This is the common way that, and it matches, everything that I read about it as well. So just quickly moving into, I have a neat way, I think, that you might find interesting in terms of parts. So while we're always, when we're coaching, wanting to move someone toward wholeness, right? We don't ever want to create more parts for a person. We always want to be, which is, again, just as like a little history of NLP, they used to actually do something called the six-step reframe, which in some schools, I think they still do, which was a little bit of a problem, because essentially what it would do is it would take, it's been replaced by core transformation in our school, and parts integration, and linguistic parts, like any of those ones. But what a six-step reframe would do is it would take a part, and then it would identify the bad behavior of the part, and it would replace it with a good behavior. So what it was doing was like, oh, there's a part of you that wants to like bite your fingers. Well, there's a part of you that wants to self-soothe, or it wants to get calm, or whatever the highest intention of the part is by biting the nails. And so the six-step reframe would actually say, well, what's a better way for you to calm yourself? What's a better way for you to soothe yourself? And it would replace like finger biting with, say, squeezing your hands together in a rhythmic sort of like making that become the thing that calms you, which is nice for a client who doesn't want to bite their fingernails anymore, because now they have this really sort of like socially appropriate, graceful way of calming themselves. And it is similar, I think, to an anchor for some people. But what the problem is that you still let the part be a separate part, right? It's still a part that doesn't get integrated or merged into the whole. And we don't really want to be leaving parts separated, right? We want to integrate the parts. So with shame, however, shame is very, very, very distrustful of the self, right? The shame has basically the way that shame is structured and formed means that it doesn't trust its own expectations, right? So if I have shame around, say, I feel shame around, let me think of a good example. Like, My communication. No, that's not a good one. Can someone think of a good like solid shame that you run into sometimes with clients? Yeah, okay, not showing up. Thank you, Kristen. So I feel this shame because I don't show up. So I know that what I should do, right? My own expectation of what I should do is that I should show up and I should attend these meetings, or I should, whatever. And yet I don't. For whatever reason, there's a part of me that doesn't show up, and I feel a massive amount of shame around it. And I give it names like I'm lazy, I don't apply myself, I don't have any commitment, or whatever the case may be. So you're shaming yourself by not showing up. What happens is there's a part that doesn't trust yourself, right? Obviously, you have a part that says, like, I know what the expectation is. I know that I should be showing up, but I'm unable to, and therefore I'm shamed. It's really important to create a self that can be trusted before we go into a lot of the other work, if you're doing a breakthrough of someone. Because if the shame is distrusting, you can build all sorts of like parts. You can clear emotions. You can do all sorts of stuff where you reconnect and you reinvigorate these really positive parts of the self. But if the shame doesn't trust itself, the part that feels the shame doesn't trust itself to be able to meet those expectations, you can actually start to create a bigger divide. So what can sort of happen is like you recognize that there's, you go back to a time when you, didn't show up to something as a child, and you clear that, and it's real. Like it's actually done the job of clearing the gestalt, and you have learnings, and you have a transformation of, I don't need to feel shame about that event anymore, and you clear the emotion. But what you may have still is a part of you that doesn't trust that you can live up to this expectation. And so the work that I find is really important to do when you're dealing with one of these clients where you know that shame is like a real driver to what's in their way, is you've got to create a sense of trust between the self that is going to create expectation and the self that is going to work to meet the expectation. And so the way that I would do this is to do a 2-part core transformation. So I think everyone here has learned core transformation. And so it's kind of cool. It's like a parts integration, a little bit like a traditional one that you learned in prac with us, where with, TAD version, where you take the 2 hands and you bring them together. But because it's in the structure of a core transformation, it's actually allowing the parts to get to their highest intention, but to connect to the whole, instead of just being like 2 parts through an integration, which would merge with each other, but maybe not the whole. And so what you end up doing is you do a core transformation. And you would take one part, just as you normally always do, the part of you that sets expectation for yourself. And you would identify where that part is and find the part that sets expectation. And it will be really familiar to the person, because that's a big part of shame, is the part that knows they should be doing better, right? And you would find that part, get them to identify wherever that part is, right? Like wherever physically that part is, and ask that part what it wants. And then you ask that part, once it's answered the first intention of what it wants, you just tell it to rest, to set aside, to just sort of hang out there for a minute. And then you go to the part that feels the shame, that feels as though it never meets expectation, even though it knows what it is, that familiar feeling of shame because you didn't meet the expectation. And you find where that part of them resides within them, and ask that part for its first intention, right? For the first thing that it wants, and then let it rest there. And now you have these 2 parts who have both started the first step of a core transformation, who are sitting there in their first intended outcome, which already you guys have all you all know this experience, it already feels better. 99% of the time, it feels better, even just getting to that first intended outcome, right? Because there's a relief in like, you get out of the relentless feeling and emotion that it's been like sitting in, or the behavior or whatever. And it's at least lifted itself out into like, yeah, that's right, I do want something. And it gets to say it, right? So both parts have said it, and there's a relief there. And now you have the person just experience, like, notice what it's like now when each of these parts already has what it first wants. And then you just do a core transformation with each part, sort of one over here. And then, and everyone who's done advanced core transformation already knows this technique, but for those of you that haven't, you can still do this, because you're doing nothing different from the original script. You know, keep the script in front of you, make sure you're following it as it is, but all you're doing is you're alternating. So you're going back and forth between these parts. And the only difference is that you check at each intended outcome to notice what it feels like when each of these parts have what they want. And you would just sort of let them go up to their highest intention. And if one gets there before the other, then you just keep going with the other until it gets there. And then they may, you know, if you're lucky, they actually get to the same intention, which is always awesome. And they usually do. Or even if they get to different ones, though, like even if one gets to love and one gets to peace, or one gets to wholeness and one gets to connection, or whatever the case, it doesn't matter. They're both at a core state, right? So you know that it's going to be like a state that can be across all experiences. So once they get to those core states, just allow, again, if it's one or if it's two, allow them to have that experience. And then notice that there is no reason to, the language I would use, sorry, I just want to get my language right. Notice the trust between these parts. And I would say that are two, or if they've merged, if they have a shared intention, that used to be two. But you're just noticing the trust. What the first part was. Oh, the first part was the part who sets the expectation. The second part is the part that does not live up to that expectation, who feels shame because it doesn't live up to the expectation. So you just have them notice, have an experience of trust. And so trust is what it translates to, what the experience always ends up being, is like a full core feeling of trust. And then just reverse the parts and bring it out into the future, and have them notice the resourcefulness now when they're in the future. And I would do that before I would do a lot of the other work. I can't tell you exactly when. I can't tell you whether or not I would do that like before I clear anything or where, but early on, I would say like in the first few sessions, I would do that, because it just seems to, every time the shame then tries to like come up, where it would normally sort of try and come up and say, yeah, but, like, yeah, but, it mutes that. Like, it really creates a sense instead of like, there may be hesitation still, there may be caution still, there may be sort of like a tenderness or something there, but it normally allows the person to step through the expected shame, or the habitual historical shame. It allows them to sort of step through it much more easily into, okay, I'm just going to trust. And when you have self-trust, when you actually can believe yourself that you're good enough, when you can believe yourself that your own expectation is one that you can have authorship, that you can reclaim and you can define. And of course, they're going to work with you as a coach on redefining all their expectations so that every one of them is reasonable and reachable, and, you know, all of that. And so you end up with this really beautiful relationship between the self and the expectations set for the self. And it really takes shame out of its familiar, sort of comfortable place where it can always just like interfere and get in the way and bring the person down. So I just want to put that out there. I'll answer questions in a second. The other thing that is far more basic, and I just forgot to say it, shame lives in secrecy, in silence, and in judgment. Right. So depending on the level of rapport that you have with your client, if you can bring it out of secrecy, that alone often is all you need to do. Like very often, just because you've gotten to the place where the person can finally say the thing they feel about themselves is out in the open. And shame is so often invited out with guilt and then let it be expressed and experienced as shame, right? So because guilt and shame or embarrassment or humiliation or whatever are so frequently combined, very often where you feel guilt, you will also feel shame. They're not the same thing. They're not the same elements of that experience or whatever. What were there three? Oh, secrecy, silence, judgment. Shame cannot exist without secrecy, silence, and judgment. Arguably, because I'm thinking some shame can still survive not having secrecy. Anyway, yeah, so often bringing it out, because shame is so isolating, right? When we feel shame, we feel as though we are unforgivable. It's the reason we still feel shame. If we thought it was a forgivable thing, then we wouldn't be harboring this feeling of shame around it, right? So whatever the thing is, I'm not good enough, I'm not strong enough, I'm not capable, like whatever the shame is around, we believe that it is a quality about ourselves that doesn't feel relatable, right? It's not like guilt or embarrassment or anything that we can say like, hey guys, you know how you do that thing where you like lay in bed and then you, do X, Y, and Z. If you thought that everybody did it and that it was, then you would just say it. But shame doesn't believe that. Shame believes that you're the only one, especially in kids, guys, especially in kids, which is where we all pick up our shame, right? You think you're the only one having this experience. You think you're the only one lying in bed listening to your parents argue, right? You don't know or believe that anybody else is having that experience. You don't believe that if you share this, that anybody in the room or the space is going to say, yeah, you know what? I've had that too. Or potentially you're aligning yourself with people that you judge harshly, right? So it may be that you think only you and the guy over there on the other side of the room who's gross and disgusting also does or shares or whatever. And the relation to that person that you are judging so harshly is what causes you to feel that shame, right? So it's isolating, or it aligns you with something that disgusts you that you are judging. So because of that, like often just bringing it out and finally being able to hear somebody say, and this is where we're no different than like counselors. This is where counseling, to be honest, like talk therapy, traditional talk therapy is very, 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 very good because very, very often for somebody to just go and say, here's me, and have somebody else say, yeah, you and a million other people, you and me, right? So when you're outside of a coaching environment, we know that compassion, true compassion, is not offering sympathy. It's not offering advice. It's not bringing somebody a bread when they're sick or, whatever. That's kindness. That's generosity. That's all sorts of other beautiful things. Compassion, true compassion is saying, I've been there too. What you're feeling, I have felt too. And that aspect of compassion, when you offer compassion, which is why this little triangle this little square I started with, compassion is always the answer to shame. And so very often you as their coach are going to be their first view, right? Like you're going to be the first one often where they've brought shame out of the darkness, where they've actually let it out of its secrecy and its silence. And they are vulnerable enough and they have enough trust, or you've beat them down or whatever, that they actually bring it out. And then you're the first one to be able to say, you're not alone. I've experienced that. So many of my clients have experienced that, whatever it is. And then the judgment now, guys, is where we just do, there is nothing better that I have ever run into in all of my studies and all of everything that is better than timeline therapy to deal with judgment. There is no quantum healing. There is no, there's nothing. Judgment is something where you want to go in and you want to find those beliefs the sources and the root of the beliefs of the judgment. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So I want to leave it there. It is 8:30, so it's good to leave it there. In terms of tools, I don't think that there's anything else specifically that I would that I would use directly for shame. That double core transformation is been just like gold for me in terms of being able to get through shame. And of course, clearing it all on its own, right? So I don't even call it you want to clear anger, sadness, fear, hurt, guilt, and shame. Right? Always just add on the shame. And I would get really, really familiar with that distinction between guilt and shame so that because everyone resonates with it, right? Everyone knows the difference between the things they feel guilt about in contrast to the things they feel shame about, and your reaction is very, very different, right? You have a very different reaction to when you feel guilty than to when you feel shame. Questions? I'm just going to check the chat to make sure I saw everything.
So Tara, in step 2, after clearing the emotions, when you do that core transformation on the presenting problem, you could do like a 3-part, like presenting problem plus these 2 parts. Would that make sense to do that there?
It would also make sense. The presenting problem, I guess it may not be shame, but it's likely to be a shame variant, right? The presenting problem. Yes. Yeah, you can do, I love doing 3-part ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
4 parts. I don't know.
I do. I love adding the observer too, just to mess everything
you
up.
You taught me that one with your own client.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, there's the witness part here that we need to. I was like, oh yeah, that part. Peanut gallery part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tanya's referring to sometimes when I do the 2 parts of the core transformation, I'll also add in, because we all have an observer part. There's always a part of us that watches ourselves do our little dance of life and emotions and everything else. And so adding that observer part in can be really, really neat as well, because it's quite important to the process. But I don't want to complicate it too much. Yeah.
This is so good because I've had a lot of clients lately who don't trust in their ability to sort of change what needs to be changed for them to reach their goals. And it's exactly this, it's
because
they're not living up to the expectations. They have a history of sort of bailing on themselves.
Yeah.
This is so juicy.
Yeah. Any form of I don't deserve, I don't believe in it is usually like, I don't deserve to believe in it. I've let myself down too many times. I don't deserve to believe in my own change. Like, it's hardcore when people can't believe in their own change. And it is always shame-based that like they just won't give themselves permission. Because if they didn't think about it, if they had no shame, and again, I'm not saying that's possible, but if they had no shame, you would say, okay, imagine yourself being like wildly confident and totally in charge of your health and, blah, 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 blah. Just imagine yourself that way. And they would be like, yeah, let's go. Like there would be nothing in the way then, right? If they didn't have a part of them that was like, are you kidding me? That's not you, because you don't do these things. Yeah, you set goals for yourself, but you don't meet them, you fool, right? Like it's this very shame-based conversation. And so getting that out of the way, I do have clients who have successfully come through shame. And the difference is that they start to go, okay, I've never been successful with this before, but they now recognize that shame was always in the way. And they're like, if I just believe in this like new self, right? That this like trusting self, I can do things that I've never done before. And because they can believe in a new self that is not yet tainted with shame, it's not yet tainted with disappointment. Like it's like you can allow them to create a belief and a trust in themselves because they recognize that they've never experienced themselves this way before, which is what emerged core transformation does. It actually creates a new sense of self. Larissa.
And I just, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Was someone else going to talk?
No. Larissa just came into the room.
Oh. And this, I think, fits in really nicely with that exercise you've given us in the past. That sort of, these are my words, the conditions of enoughness, where you set yourself like a micro intention, like I'm going to pick up this dirty vessel and drink from it.
Yeah.
Good job, me. I did that thing. This would be a nice tasking after this integration.
Absolutely. Do you guys know what she's talking about? So Tanya's referring to the conscious mind being the authority. So I talked a while ago about how what often happens to people is that they don't follow through. So they don't follow through with like a million different things. And I always take pity on us mothers who like don't ever finish anything because you can't walk down the stairs without something like distracting you, interrupting you. But I'm sure it happens in a billion different contexts. And what starts to happen is that you actually condition your brain. It's all like the muscle in your brain, the conditioning starts to go, oh, well, I guess we don't actually really do the things we think we're going to do or commit to doing or say we're going to do. And so when you start to give it authority, like when you start to give it instruction, your brain, so you say to your brain, you know, tomorrow morning, I'm going to wake up at 6 o'clock and I'm going to do that meditation. And your brain goes, all right, well, we'll see. Right. It's waiting for you to be like, well, unless, you know, something else comes up. So what Tanya is referring to is to recondition your brain to get back into a place where it can actually trust that your conscious mind is the authority, which it should be. Then you can say to yourself, as Tanya just did beautifully, like something that you are going to do anyway. Like I have to go pee. I'm going to go to the washroom. And then when you get to the washroom, you actually like mindfully notice that, like, see that? I said I was going to the washroom and what did I do? I went straight there. Or like, I am now going to pick up my phone. Oh, picked up my phone. Look at that, mind. I did it. And it's like exercising a muscle. And so, yeah, it's really, really, that would be a great task after you've integrated the trust back into the self. Cool. Thanks, Tanya. All right. Who else has got a question? Somebody had one in the chat there. Oh, Nicole, I will send you information on the core transformation workshops.
Question.
Yeah.
If you're bringing in that, you know, like the observer part, and you're doing it at the same time as the 2 core transformations, like you only have 2 hands. Like, are you doing it all at the same time?
Oh, you don't use your hands. You don't use your hands because you're
not doing the hands one.
Nope. Okay. You use your hands on the parts integration.
Yeah.
And they're so confusable, but the parts integration is where you use the 2 hands and they come together. This is the core transformation, which is you just locate the part within your body.
Okay.
You actually, because you haven't done PACE, have you?
I think I did some of PACE. I think
remember.
It was in a little bit.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk after. If you don't have it, I'll get it to you.
Okay.
Yeah, because a core transformation, you don't need hands for. You just have them identified. Usually like one part will be in the chest, one part will be in the head, one part will be in the gut, you know, or in the jaw or something like that. And you work from the body. You start from where the body is because you're working with all the little embodied selves. Ashley, you said, wait, when a client is judging themselves, for the LDs. So for the limiting decisions, when I said just clear it, like there's nothing better for judgment than to just use timeline, like the limiting decisions, because judgment is always 100% of the time, judgment is in the structure of a belief, right? I think it's a thought. We don't judgment isn't like a feeling. It's not an emotion. Judgment is a structured thought. So when I said you always want to clear it, is you want to identify. So if somebody feels shame about their lack of success, right? So I hate going to Christmas dinners because I feel so much shame that I don't make as much money as my siblings or something like that. Then you would want to go to, where is the source, the root of the judgment that you decided that that success is measured by a person's wealth? When did you make that decision, right? Or when did you make the decision? So you want to go back to the point of decision on the judgment that is causing the shame.
Thank you. Cool.
Yeah. Larissa. Almost. You're still on mute, Larissa. Oh, she knows. Technical difficulties. Does anyone have a question in the meantime? I can't see everyone. Go.
I don't know that I have a question as much as a comment. I was listening to a podcast the other day and I heard, it was a hot take. I don't know if anyone has studied or is familiar with Irene Lyon and her work in somatics and trauma, but she was suggesting controversially that there can be occasionally like a healthy shame. And she used the example. So there's a podcast on parenting, and the example was like, she said she has a young childhood memory where she was about to pick up a knife, like from the sharp end first, like she was young, and her dad said no, and it was like this big, like, so she identifies it as shame in her system, but it was like healthy and not toxic in her understanding. And she clarifies the difference, because if it's like, no, don't do that, like there's so many ways that can go wrong when you say that to a child. But anyway, so I'm learning more about that, and I figured I'd put it out there. I can put a link to her work or the podcast.
That's so interesting. I'm getting more and more interested in somatic work as well, because I think that there's just, it's so necessary, right, to address all the somatic stuff that's going on as well. I would so argue that, though. Like, holy smokes, would I ever argue that? I would say that that's like, first of all, guilt, not shame, right? Like, he's not saying you're bad. He was saying picking up the knife is bad, which is her behavior, not her. So it would fall solidly into like, yeah, there is healthy guilt for sure. Like, for sure there's healthy guilt, right? If you pick up a knife and, hurt somebody, you best feel guilty about that so that you can get the learnings from that and never do it again. And I think that you don't need to hold on to the guilt, though. You just, if she's talking about a somatic experience, I bet you that there's not, because guilt and shame is distinguished. It is actually felt different, but it would be interesting. I'll follow that link if you put it out there, because I think that's a really interesting discussion. But I think in like linguistically, in terms of the type of structure of work that we do, that would still be guilt. It would be useful. Very, very much in the same way that like touching a hot stove. Right? Touching a hot stove is a really important lesson to learn, but you don't need to hold on to any of that pain in order to take the lessons and learn not to touch the hot stove again. You just need the lessons and the learnings. Interesting. Cool.
Thank you.